It was 1962, the height of the Cold War, and the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of war, and behind the scenes, an invisible war was already raging, one fought by spies, double agents, and operatives in the shadows. For CIA officer Daniel Carter, this was the most dangerous time of his life. Daniel had been recruited into the CIA straight out of university, drawn by the allure of adventure, patriotism, and the chance to make a difference in a world divided by ideology. Now, years later, he was a seasoned operative, but the thrill of espionage had long faded. The stakes had never been higher, and one wrong move could mean the end of everything. On a rainy October night, Daniel sat in a dimly lit safe house in West Berlin, waiting for a contact who had risked everything to smuggle vital information out of the Soviet Union. The city, divided by the infamous Berlin Wall, was a hotbed of espionage. On one side, the Soviet-backed East Germans patrolled the streets with paranoia, while on the other, the Americans and their allies watched and waited for any sign of weakness. It was a game of chess, with every move carefully calculated, and every misstep potentially fatal. The door creaked open, and in walked Dmitry Ivanov, a Soviet scientist turned informant. His face was pale, his clothes soaked from the relentless rain. Dmitry's defection to the West had been in the works for months, and tonight was supposed to be the final exchange, documents for asylum. But something in Dmitry's eyes told Daniel that something had gone terribly wrong. "They know," Dmitry whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "They know everything." Daniel's heart sank. If the Soviets had discovered Dmitry's defection, it meant the entire operation was compromised. He stood, pacing the small room as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "What do you mean they know?" Daniel asked, his voice low but urgent. "How did they find out?" Dmitry shook his head, wiping the rain from his brow. "I don't know, maybe someone talked, maybe they've been watching me all along, but I barely made it out. They were waiting for me." Daniel cursed under his breath. This wasn't just a simple defection anymore. This was a manhunt, and they were both at the center of it. "We have to move," Daniel said, grabbing the documents Dmitry had brought with him. "Is there anyone who followed you?" Dmitry hesitated. "I don't know, I lost them in the alleys, but I can't be sure." There was no time to lose. If the KGB was onto Dmitry, they wouldn't stop until both men were dead, or worse, captured. Daniel grabbed his coat and gestured for Dmitry to follow him. As they stepped out into the cold, damp streets of West Berlin, Daniel's mind raced with possible escape routes. They had planned to move Dmitry through a network of safe houses, but now, every step felt like a gamble. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few pedestrians hurrying to escape the rain, but Daniel knew that eyes were everywhere. They would need to disappear, fast. The two men made their way through the narrow back alleys, avoiding the main roads and checkpoints. Daniel's senses were on high alert, every sound amplified by the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a game of cat and mouse anymore, this was survival. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The building was nondescript, one of many Cold War-era safe havens scattered across Berlin. Daniel knocked on the door in a specific pattern, and a moment later, it opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. She was one of the agency's most trusted assets in Berlin, known only by her codename, Martha. "Get inside," she said, her eyes scanning the street before shutting the door behind them. Once inside, Daniel handed her the documents. "We need to get these to Langley as soon as possible. They're onto us." Martha took the papers and nodded. "I'll make sure they're sent immediately. But you two need to stay hidden for now. The East Germans are crawling all over the city. They've locked down most of the checkpoints." Dmitry collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said quietly. I thought I could get out." Daniel looked at him, his expression unreadable. "None of us think it'll come to this until it does. But you're in it now, and we need to get you out of Berlin before the Soviets find you," Martha interrupted. "There's a train leaving for Frankfurt in 2 hours. It'll be heavily monitored, but it's your best shot. I can arrange for you to board unnoticed, but you'll need to make it to the station without being seen." Daniel nodded. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only one they had. He turned to Dmitri. "Get some rest while you can. We move in an hour." As Dmitri tried to calm his nerves, Daniel sat with Martha, going over the details of the escape plan. Every step had to be flawless, or they would be caught. The train station was a known choke point, but Martha had contacts, people who could turn a blind eye at the right moment. They would need to rely on that, and on luck. The hour passed quickly, and soon, they were back on the streets. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. Daniel kept his hand close to the concealed pistol in his coat, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. Dmitri followed closely behind, his face pale and drawn. As they approached the station, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold: a black car parked just down the street, its windows tinted. He couldn't be sure, but something about it felt wrong. He stopped, pulling Dmitri into a nearby alley. "Wait here," Daniel whispered, his eyes fixed on the car. He moved cautiously, trying to get a better look without drawing attention. As he edged closer, the door of the car opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. KGB. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. They were already here. Somehow, they had found them. He hurried back to Dmitri, his mind racing. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice tense. "The KGB is here. We can't go to the station." Dmitri's face went pale. "What do we do?" Daniel glanced around, searching for another way out. The station was a dead end now, and they had no time to come up with a new plan. But then he spotted something, a delivery truck parked nearby, the driver unloading crates. It wasn't much, but it might be their only shot. "We're going to hitch a ride," Daniel said, pulling Dmitri toward the truck. The driver was distracted, busy with his cargo, and didn't notice as Daniel and Dmitri slipped into the back of the truck. The inside was cramped, filled with boxes of supplies, but it was better than being out in the open. "Stay quiet," Daniel whispered as they huddled in the darkness. Minutes later, the truck started moving, and Daniel felt a brief surge of relief. They were out of immediate danger, but the threat of being discovered was ever present. As the truck rumbled through the streets, Daniel's mind was already racing ahead, trying to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay in Berlin, not with the KGB closing in. After what felt like hours, the truck came to a stop. Daniel peeked out through a crack in the door and saw that they were on the outskirts of the city, near a smaller, less guarded checkpoint. It was their chance. "Come on," Daniel said, motioning for Dmitri to follow. They slipped out of the truck and made their way toward the checkpoint. The guards were East German, not Soviet, which gave them a slim advantage. Martha's contacts had arranged for forged papers, and if everything went according to plan, they would be able to slip through unnoticed. As they approached the checkpoint, Daniel handed the guard their papers, his heart pounding. The guard barely glanced at them before waving them through. For a moment, Daniel couldn't believe it, they were through. But just as they passed the final barrier, a shout rang out behind them. Daniel turned to see one of the guards pointing in their direction, his hand on his radio. The KGB must have alerted the checkpoint. "Run," Daniel shouted, grabbing Dmitri's arm. They bolted, sprinting down the road as the guards gave chase. Bullets whizzed past them, and the sound of barking dogs echoed in the distance. Daniel's lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. They had come too far to be caught now. Up ahead, Daniel spotted a small farmhouse, its windows dark. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. They veered off the road and sprinted toward the house, bursting through the door just as the guards closed in. Inside, the house was empty, abandoned. Daniel slammed the door shut and barricaded it with a heavy table. "We can't stay here," Dmitri panted, his face pale with exhaustion. "I know," Daniel said, his mind racing. "But we need to buy some time." Outside, the guards were closing in. They could hear the sound of boots on the gravel, the low growls of the dogs. Time was running out. Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. Daniel rushed to the window and saw a jeep speeding down the road. "Reinforcements." "We have to move," Daniel said, grabbing Dmitri. But just as they prepared to make their escape, the door burst open, and the guards flooded in. Daniel drew his pistol, firing a few desperate shots, but it was too late. They were surrounded. The KGB agent stepped forward, a cold smile on his face. "It's over, Carter." Daniel lowered his weapon, his mind racing. There had to be a way out of this. He couldn't let them take Dmitri, not after everything they had been through. But before he could act, Dmitri stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking. "I'll go with you, just let him go." The KGB agent laughed. "You think we're going to let the American walk free? You're both coming with us." Daniel felt a surge of anger and helplessness. They had been so close, and now it was all falling apart. But then, in a moment of desperation, Dmitri lunged at the KGB agent, knocking him to the ground. The room erupted into chaos, and Daniel seized the opportunity. He grabbed Dmitri and bolted for the door, pushing past the stunned guards. Outside, the reinforcements were closing in, but Daniel wasn't giving up. He spotted a motorcycle parked nearby and made a split-second decision. "Get on," he shouted, and they sped off into the night. The chase was on, but Daniel wasn't thinking about the danger anymore. All that mattered was getting Dmitri out. The motorcycle roared down the narrow roads, dodging trees and potholes as Daniel pushed the engine to its limit. Dmitri held on tightly, his face pale but determined. The sound of gunfire echoed behind him as the KGB agents gave chase, but Daniel knew these roads better than most. West Berlin was still ahead, freedom within reach if they could only stay ahead of the Soviets for a little longer. As they approached a bridge that marked the dividing line between East and West Berlin, Daniel saw a roadblock set up ahead. Guards, dogs, and a handful of black sedans, the KGB had anticipated this route. His heart pounded as he realized that they were about to be trapped. "We're not going to make it," Dmitri shouted over the roar of the wind and engine. "We'll have to," Daniel said through gritted teeth, his eyes scanning the terrain for a way out. Then, just to the right of the bridge, he saw a narrow side path leading down into the dark woods. It wasn't an official route, but he knew where it led, towards a forgotten trail that could cross into the west. Without hesitation, Daniel swerved the motorcycle off the main road and into the woods. The bike bounced and skidded on the uneven ground, but Daniel kept his grip firm, weaving between trees as they barreled through the forest. The sounds of the chase were still behind them, but fading as the terrain grew more difficult to navigate for the heavy vehicles. The minutes stretched on, with the forest growing darker, and the only sound being the humming of the motorcycle engine and their labored breathing. But finally, they reached the edge of the trees. In the distance, Daniel could see the faint glow of West Berlin, its lights a symbol of safety and hope. "There it is," Dmitri cried, his voice filled with relief. "We're almost there." But just as they neared the final stretch, disaster struck. The motorcycle hit a rock, and the back tire blew out. The bike skidded, throwing both men to the ground with a jarring thud. Daniel groaned as pain shot through his side, but he forced himself to his feet, grabbing Dmitri and pulling him up. "We have to keep moving," Daniel urged, limping as he dragged Dmitri toward the faint lights in the distance. Their pursuers would be on foot now. There was no time to rest. The sounds of barking dogs and shouts were closer than ever. The KGB was closing in, and Daniel knew they only had minutes, maybe seconds, to reach the safety of the border. As they stumbled through the last stretch of forest, Daniel saw a break in the trees ahead. Just beyond was a small border crossing, manned by Western soldiers. The soldiers were armed but unsuspecting, not yet aware of the deadly chase happening just beyond their view. "Over there," Daniel gasped, pulling Dmitri along. They broke from the trees and sprinted toward the crossing. Behind them, the KGB agents emerged from the woods, shouting commands and raising their weapons. Daniel and Dmitri ran as fast as they could, but the shots were fired. Bullets whizzed past them, striking the dirt and trees around them. The world seemed to slow down as Daniel pushed Dmitri ahead, praying they could make it to the Western guards. "Help, we're Americans," Daniel shouted, waving his arms desperately as they neared the border post. The Western soldiers, startled, sprang into action, raising their rifles and moving toward the approaching figures. They quickly understood what was happening when they saw the armed Soviets charging from the woods. "Stop right there," one of the Western guards commanded, but Daniel and Dmitri kept running until they were behind the cover of the soldiers. The KGB agents came to a halt, realizing they had reached the line. Crossing it would mean starting an international incident, a breach of the fragile peace. For a moment, there was silence. The Western soldiers stood firm, their guns trained on the Soviets, while Daniel and Dmitri panted behind them, utterly spent. The lead Soviet agent, his face twisted in frustration, glared at Daniel with cold, piercing eyes. "This isn't over, Carter," he spat in Russian, knowing full well that Daniel understood. Without another word, the Soviets backed off, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had come. Daniel collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, the weight of their escape finally hitting him. Dmitri, sitting beside him, laughed in disbelief, tears of relief in his eyes. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. "You did it," Dmitri said, looking at Daniel with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "You got me out." Daniel shook his head, still catching his breath. "We're not out yet, there's still a lot of work to do. But for now, they were safe." The border guards helped him up, leading them to a nearby transport vehicle. As they drove towards the safety of the American sector in West Berlin, Daniel stared out the window at the darkened cityscape, knowing that this night had changed everything. In the coming days, Dmitri's defection and the information he carried would make headlines across the world. The documents he had smuggled out would help the West in the high-stakes standoff of the Cold War, potentially averting catastrophe. But for Daniel, it was just one battle in a much larger, invisible war that still raged on, far from the public eye. As the jeep rumbled down the road, Daniel let himself close his eyes for a brief moment of rest. He knew it wouldn't last. There would always be another mission, another crisis, another call. But for now, they had bought themselves a little more time, standing once again on the edge of the abyss.